some of the most iconic piece of entertainment, the Dark Knight Trilogy, Man of Steel, Foundation Season 1, Season 2, and
the seminal work of science fiction, it would have to be Foundation. Incredibly difficult to adapt. In order for it to work, it had to appeal to a larger audience than people like yourselves or myself.
What do you look at and say, that was very successful?
It's hard as an artist to write something and direct something and put your heart and your soul into something and then give it out to the world and then have people, pick it apart. At the same time, you can't make decisions based on what you think the audience will want.
Piece of pop culture that has influenced the most last 20, 15, 20 years. The Dark Knight is up there. Talk about your process, Nolan's process.
We got very lucky. Warner Brothers was desperate. And because they were desperate, they were open to the idea of innovation.
A studio calls you, they give you a piece of IP, and they're like, hey, make this into an amazing movie. Where do you start? Ladies and gentlemen, this is a very, very special episode of the Aarthi and Sriram show. Now, I have introduced guests before with all sorts of emotions. There are people I've admired. There are people I've grown up watching, do amazing things on TV. But this individual, not only am I a huge fan of his work, but the overwhelming emotion I feel when I think about this person is total jealousy, right? Because you, David S. Goyer, have the career and the life that 10-year-old me would have killed to have had. So let me just kind of read out a few phrases which would tell you why, I'm just so envious of David, and if there's a way I could kind of steal his life, I would. The Dark Knight Trilogy with Nolan, Man of Steel, Batman versus Superman, Foundation Season 1, Season 2, and probably many, many more seasons to come, which, by the way, if you folks haven't seen Foundation Season 2 till the finale, stop watching, go watch it. We just watched it and we are like, it's amazing, blows your mind. And so much more work in comics and TV and movie to come. David, you are a legend. I'm so jealous of you. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
I appreciate I appreciate the introduction. It's always funny to hear someone say something like that externally from you, because I'm just doing my thing and I have my life and my wife and my 3 kids, and we're complaining about this thing or that, or we're just normal people like everyone else, and I've got my challenges. By the way, I'm wearing a Foundation crew shirt right now.
I like it. I like it.
I thought it would be all the different departments on Foundation sort of made their own shirts, whether it be the art department, the transportation department. So there's maybe 10 or 12 different kind of crew shirts floating around.
Oh my gosh. Okay. I might need to hit you up and see whether you can sneak me a few. But I just genuinely mean that, because for both Aarthi and me, if you think about our childhood influences, for me, growing up in India, one was the Chris Reeve Superman movies, right? Like,
Sure.
That theme, the John Williams score hits and it takes me to a different place. And you obviously worked on, the next incarnation of that. Batman, watching Keaton, well, Keaton's back, watching Keaton, like iconic. But when I really got into reading sci-fi, and I think Odyssey Clark and Asimov were probably 2 of the biggest influences. And no self-respecting nerd in Silicon Valley has not grown up being inspired by Foundation, right? Like, and psychohistory.
Sure.
And kind of, and by the way, growing up, I was like, India, I was like, oh, Hari Seldon is maybe he's an Indian name, maybe he's in India. So there were so many different things. And the fact that you have basically gotten access to the toy box and created, and I'm saying this not to flatter you, some of the most iconic piece of entertainment, just truly amazing. So this is quite the honor. Okay. So I want to get into all of it, right? And I want to start with Foundation, which Aarthi and I, we binge watch, we kind of caught up on a bunch of episodes and we watched season 2. And now I want to start with maybe, because there's season 1, season 2, but Foundation, if I think about it as a story, right? It is notoriously hard to adapt. And by the way, I'm sort of a nerd. I invest, I do tech stuff. I don't create entertainment like you do. But a few things. Number one, if I recall, and you should correct me, Asimov never kind of pieced it together as he kind of made it up as he went along. It was never really meant to be like one cohesive book. Retconned a bunch of stuff in with like,
Yes.
the robotic stuff. Two is there is no central character, right? Like there's like, it's the idea of psychohistory, but then Hari Seldon shows up with every crisis and you have like, oh, it's a new set of characters and oh, then you have the mule and blah, blah, blah. So, and it is kind of one of these kind of things that are notorious, oh, it's never going to show up. So maybe talk to me about like, and I know you're a fan of the books, like when something like shows up, like how do you even like put your hands around and be like, all right, how do I take this and make this into compelling stuff that we can watch on our couch? Where do you even start?
Well, it's almost the Bible of science fiction. I mean, I think if you were to pick the seminal work of science fiction, it would have to be Foundation, whether it's Star Wars or Dune, all of these things that came in the shadow of it. And I'm an enormous fan of Arthur C. Clarke and Frederick Pohl and Alfred Bester and all the other sort of classics. But I think if you had to pick one book in science fiction, it would be Foundation, or one series of books. So it has this hallowed place in the hearts of people like yourself and your peers in the tech industry, and is really the Bible of science fiction. But as you rightly said, it started up as a fix-up novel, a series of short stories. There's very little continuity from one story or novella to the next. We jump forward hundreds of years. He was making it up as he was going along. He didn't originally envision this. He ended up writing some sequels and some prequels in which he retconned and changed a bunch of things. Incredibly difficult to adapt. And, we were forced to figure out how do we, in order for it to work, it had to appeal to a larger audience than people like yourselves or myself, right? It had to appeal to people that did not think of themselves as readers of science fiction in the same way that Game of Thrones, I think, broke some of the barrier for fantasy. There was no way to make it without a significant budget. So we had to reach a fairly large audience. Asimov is famously, his characters are not particularly well drawn, most of them. A lot of them are mouthpieces for ideas. There's very little action. A lot of things happen off screen. It's a lot of people talking in rooms. There aren't any female characters in the first book because the reader audience at the time in the late 40s and 50s was almost exclusively men. There were a few women that were writing under male pen names. So we had to update the metaphors that he was working with. He was writing in a post-World War II environment. Then we had to come up with some continuity because no one was going to greenlight an anthological show. No one. There was a short period after Black Mirror where people were also greenlighting anthological shows. And trust me, that is not something the streamers are interested in right now. So we had to figure out, using some of the tropes of science fiction, how can we have some of these characters continue on? The first thing we did is decide that Harry is not just a recording that you can't interact with, which he is in the books, but he's an AI, a digital being that you can continue to interact with. And that decision in and of itself somewhat changes the premise of Foundation because he continues on as an existing character. We had to figure out how to make other characters through the use of cryogenic sleep. Right. They could continue onward. Asimov had this character, Demerzel, who was a robot that appeared in the prequels. We brought that character into the roughly what we're adapting the original trilogy. That character is a robot and long-lived, so that character can span the centuries. And then we had to figure out a character that could embody empire. So even though there is an Emperor Cleon in the books, briefly mentioned in one of the stories, shows up a little bit in the prequels, not particularly well drawn. And that's how we arrived at the idea of these cloned emperors. And so even though we were jumping forward a century or 2 centuries at a time, and even though they are different characters, the audience at least has the same faces, that they feel like the same characters in kind of ways. And so that was the big aha experience. And then that led to us exploring in lots of different ways. One of the themes of foundation of Asimov's stories and books is, do we live in a deterministic future or not, right? Does psychohistory truly have everything mapped out? Does the individual matter? Psychohistory would say no. And yet, if you look at Asimov's writing, he kind of equivocates between what they call the great man theory, in which these individuals will show up and affect the course of history. He does kind of equivocate. I mean, the Mule does that. He goes back and forth between this kind of deterministic future that psychohistory is mapped out and individuals affecting great change. And that became our main theme for the show as well. Obviously, I think a lot of the audience would like to believe that we don't live in a deterministic future in which mathematically nothing that we do matters. I mean, the audience is going to want, the former. They're going to want to feel that their lives matter, that they can leave a mark on history. And so the central theme of our show is exploring the tension between those two ideas and then using the characters to explore that as well. So then with the clones, they're trying to individuate. They're trying to, do they matter, or are they just puppets? With Demerzel, does she matter? Does she have agency, or is she trapped by psychohistory? Does the hairy AI have agency and personhood? And then that also led to something that's not in the books, but this idea of memory.
Right.
And whether or not, if we were to lose our memory, we are still us. So these are big, heady ideas. And a lot of the main ideas that we explore in the show are also the ideas that are explored in the books. But we also have the benefit of a lot of technology that has arisen in the 70 odd years since Asimov was first writing those stories. We weren't cloning humans. We couldn't edit the human genome. Artificial intelligence didn't exist. All of these things that we can add to our tool chest. I believe if he were writing Foundation now, Harry would have been interactive, would have been an AI. It's logical to assume that.
Right.
Anyway, that was a long answer.
No. There's so much to unpack over there. And, I think one of the many accomplishments of the show, and again, because I'm fanboying out here, is that one, making it accessible to a broader audience. And you always kind of have this, I think, this tension of how do we bring the core fan base along, and they're always going to hate it. They're going to be like, it's not right with the book, blah, 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 right? But then, take something that's kind of this dense sci-fi concept heavy thing and make it broader. That's number one. And I think the second part was, I think the devices that you folks invented, especially the Cleons and the genetic dynasty, in some ways, maybe even, and the moving chroma, which are kind of tiny, a lot of these things are almost more interesting than Asimov's psychohistory itself. Because, I'm curious, when you think about the Living Emperor, it kind of ties into some of the longevity themes that we hear in actual tech society today. Have you thought about that? Have you heard from, say, CEOs and others being like, oh, I want to do what Cleon's doing. I want to actually, reproduce myself.
Of course. I mean, people are experimenting with longevity, getting blood transfusions from, younger people, seeing what we can do with telomeres. Some kooky people already are, have plans that cryogenically freeze their bodies or their heads or, digitize their consciousness. I don't think we're there yet. But of course, I mean, longevity, influence, all these CEOs, I mean, they want to believe they fall into the category of the great man theory. I mean, they want to believe that, which sometimes I find ironic because so many of them, look, I don't know Elon Musk. I know he loves Foundation, right? But psychohistory would say that the great man theory doesn't exist. And yet he himself seems to be striving to do that, which is human. So there is a tension between that. And there's absolutely a tension between what I would call the die-hard book purists that want a hard science fiction show and the broader audience. And we have to try to walk this narrow path between these two audiences and hold both of them in mind.
So, David, I think following on to what Sriram had asked, to me, when I look at science fiction shows, our lives and our entire careers have been in tech, building products. We're very heavily inspired by science fiction. Like this is the reason we got into computers. This is the reason we were like obsessed with trying to build these big systems and things like this, and Sriram especially grew up watching Star Trek back in India. And that shaped a lot of how we think about systems and frameworks and how we think about technology and all of that to this day. And so for me, I've always wanted to ask, you with foundation and even, just with the work that you've done, what do you look at as that was very successful? Like for you, is it more like a tactical thing? Is it more like downloads, people watching, or subreddits, specific comments? Or do you look at it in this like arc of time where you're like, I inspired somebody else to go off and do this or build this or start a company? What do you look at and say, either short term or long term, is that was very successful?
That's a varied answer, of course.
Okay.
One measure of success for me is, do I get to keep making more seasons, right? So on a really selfish level, I enjoy making the show. It inspires me. It's incredibly hard. It takes a lot out of me. It's hard on my family because I'm over in Europe at least half the year. So selfishly, as long as I'm getting paid to create something that I love, and I have really loved the process as hard as it is with something like Foundation, as long as I get to keep doing it and make art, that's all I care about. For whatever reason Apple would decide to continue the show or not continue the show. I hope that the show is successful enough that it's driving viewers to Apple. It's not the be all and the end all to get good, critical feedback, although this season has had almost unanimously good critical feedback.
Yep.
And very good fan feedback. It all falls into the mix. But it's funny. I had this experience earlier in my career. 1998, I had two movies come out, Blade and Dark City.
Yeah.
So, and my career really took off after those two movies came out. Blade at the time was extremely successful with the box office, but the critics savaged it. I mean, since then, it's taken on a new life and a new appreciation, but the critics hated it. And Dark City came out, totally bombed at the box office, but the critics loved. So I had both experiences, and it's unusual to have a situation where you have a film or a television show that is both critically acclaimed and a kind of financial success.
Right.
And Foundation definitely seems to be that. I don't know that it's probably not Game of Thrones yet, but the audience is building, and certainly the critical acclaim is built, and that feels good. And look, we're artists. I don't know on the tech side if you feel this, but it's hard as an artist to write something and direct something and put your heart and your soul into something and then give it out to the world and then have people, pick it apart on Reddit, whatever.
No question.
This is crap, or I don't believe this, or blah, that's lazy writing. It's hard. And it's hard not to take it personally and not get depressed if people don't receive something in a certain way. And every artist, every peer of mine struggles with that. Right now, I'm in a little bit of a halo because season 2 seems to have been well received critically and by fans. Yeah. But I know that's ephemeral. I know that could go away. I know if we do a third season, it could not be as well received. Or if I do another project, you just don't know. So that's hard. And at the same time, you can't let that distract you. You can't make decisions based on what you think the audience will want. I think it's the Steve Jobs, I'm paraphrasing. You can't give the audience what they want. You have to give them what they don't know they want. Yep. And if you fall into that trap where you're trying to guess ahead of time what the audience will want, you've just lost the plot completely. And sometimes that's a tension with the studios or the streamers because they will do their research and they will say, well, our research tells us X, right? And I'm very leery of that because it's, how were the questions phrased? They're responding to this in a vacuum without the marketing and without a framework. Yeah. And, by and large, I would say my experience with Apple, I think I can safely say that my experience with Apple creatively has been the best experience I've ever had in my career, which is kind of amazing because they're a big tech company. And
in what ways?
They have largely, in almost unanimously backed my creative decisions. Even when, they express their opinion, the executives there, and say, we're not sure about this character, we're not sure about this arc. But when push came to shove, there were a few times that we reached a compromise. 9 times out of 10, more than that, if I really dug my heels and they said, okay, we'll go with what you want. And I did not expect that. I really didn't. And that has not been my experience throughout the bulk of my career.
Which is amazing because your resume is quite something. I want to come back to something you said a little bit earlier, because I think it has ties to how we deal with tech, which is in tech, you ship something, a lot of people have thoughts, and then you're already working on the next version, right?
Right.
And then
you can upgrade it.
Yeah, well, and then you have an issue of like, do I keep going on the path that I'm already on because the train's kind of already leaving the station, or do I react to this feedback coming in and then figure out, oh, I need to switch things, or do I go, no, hold on, I have good stuff, I'm just laying pipe, I have good stuff coming for you. And obviously where I'm going with this is season 1, right? Like really good. Season 2, I think for us, a lot of people, dramatically better. How many things do you go, like when people had thoughts in season 1, you were like, trust us, we know what we're doing, to get there, we need to do this. And how many times, and I would love examples where you're like, all right, maybe we need to take a slightly different direction here.
It's a little bit of both. I mean, because the show is so complicated, it roughly takes about 2 years to make a season. Mm-hmm. So by the time season 1 had come out, we had already written season 2. And I can't remember whether or not we had started shooting season 2. I think we might have started shooting. But I did take, when we went to write season 2, I went through with my writers and talked about with Apple, what are the things that we felt we did well? And let's take an honest assessment. What are the things that we felt we could do better at? What are the things we're good at? What are the things maybe we're not so good at? Can we shift some of those things? So that was a process that I had started already. It was an honest examination, soup to nuts, going through every department, stunts, costume, everything. VFX vendors, what worked, what didn't work, where can we do better? And I'd done like a Reddit AMA in season 1, and I listened to some of the feedback, and you're absolutely right. Some of the feedback is just simply, there was expositional pipe that we had to lay no matter what, that was in the same way that season 1 of Game of Thrones did, that we just had to lay it. And a lot of people that have watched season 2 have now gone back and watched season 1 and said, oh, I get it now. That's much more pleasurable for me now. Then there were challenges with COVID that were incredibly difficult to surmount. Scenes that we could only shoot part way, actors we couldn't bring back, limitations to how many extras we could have. It's not an excuse. The audience can only assess what they see on screen, but it's true. And there were creative compromises I made in season 1, more on season 1 with Skydance and Apple, because nothing had come out yet. Once they saw the finished product, they said, oh, we like this. We think you know what you're doing. And then they gave me more free reign. And then there was some feedback online that I took to heart. Mm-hmm. And I said, oh, okay, that's fair. It tracks with what I'm thinking. Mm-hmm.
Is there something? Is there something? And feel free to just not share. Is there something you can share directionally where you were like, okay, the folks on Reddit for once have a point, and I'm going to maybe take this slightly different path than before?
Well, some of it was Terminus. The Terminus storyline was not as well liked as the Empire's storyline, and that's fine. That's valid. I get it. Terminus was dusty. Empire was good and soapy. I completely understand that. And other than the first episode, there really is no direct conflict between Empire and the Foundation. So that's hard. So you have to come up with a storyline for both of them individually. So you have to come up with a threat for Empire, which was Luminism that didn't exist in the books.
Right.
And we have to extrapolate on the first crisis for the Foundation. And so one of the things that I immediately thought of was, how do we get Harry Seldon, or a version of Harry Seldon, and Empire back in the same room again? Mm-hmm. Because that wasn't by design. They weren't going to be back in the same room again, at least until season 3. And that's what led me to the idea of Harry putting a sliver of himself into Constant and then confronting Empire and doing this almost replay of a scene we'd done in the first episode. I got that idea because I thought, oh, that was really juicy. And then that led me, originally, Empire wasn't supposed to go to Terminus until season 3.
Ooh.
And I said, can I bring that forward? And then can I do something that they never did in the books, which is actually have Cleon go down to Terminus.
Right.
And that really, and so now what's happening is the Foundation storyline and the Empire storyline are inextricably linked, and they're on this collision course. And it's not just one solid story and another solid story. They're the same story. And so as a result of that feedback, that led me and my fellow writers to figure out, how do we get Seldon and the current Cleon, day 17, how do we get them in a room again a few times, which we could not have done if we followed the original books.
Yeah. I love it.
I will say, when Cleon makes it to Terminus, my jaw drops. Yeah, I'm like, oh, Sriram and I looking at each other going, he's going for it. He's actually going to go do this. Which is like, there's a lot of like, I'm going to go, I'm going to show up. And then he actually like makes a trip. And then there's, Harry Seldon, and you can see these, it's very, the whole imagery is so powerful and
Yes.
surprising. It's this element of just surprise and delight.
Yeah.
I mean,
before we move Foundation, because I was promising myself I don't want to fanboy too much for particular scenes, but there are friends of mine who love a couple of scenes, and I'm curious to get quickly your take on why they kind of work so much. And one from this season, the Riose Hober Mallow drink that they share.
Yes.
Right before, they obviously die. Talk to us a little bit about the origin of the scene, how it comes around. Like, why is it so powerful? Because everyone is so moved by the scene. Because it's so simple, just two characters talking and having a laugh. Why does it work? How did it come about?
Well, that was a scene that I had in my head from the very beginning when we were building season 2. And I knew that Hober had this treasured bottle of wine. You've heard of Chekhov's gun, which is this idea of, a plot device being introduced early on in the story that will inevitably be used later on in the story. Yep. So this was Chekhov's wine. And so I knew he had this precious bottle of wine, and that at some point in the season, he would drink it. And our first thought was that he would drink it with Constant after they were reunited. And I just thought that's too easy. And so I always try to challenge ourselves. And I knew that these two men, who were very different, Hober and Bell, were on a collision course with one another. Mm-hmm. And so I worked backwards. I decided I want to have Hober drink the wine with Bell. And I want to have the wine not be good, because that also subverts expectations. And so I worked backwards. James Cameron calls it writing towards something. So I said, how do I get these two together? And I knew that Belle was going to die a noble death and it would be in defying empire. I wasn't sure about Hober, but ultimately I decided that was the correct way to go as well. And the interesting thing about Hober, I will say, is, and I saw some of the fans saying this, they were uncertain about him when he was introduced in episode 3. They said, oh, tonally, this is goofy, this is off. And to be honest, my partners at Apple were also uncomfortable. They said, oh, this is a big tonal shift. And I just said to Apple, just go with me. Go with me. We're going to start this character in a goofy place. And over the course of the season, he's going to drop all of these defenses and become more earnest and become a hero. And then he's going to die. And because he started off as one thing and became something else, it's going to break our hearts even more.
Yes, it sort of reminds you of like a Han Solo style swashbuckling con man leading to this one. Now, very quick, I want to ask you about the other scene. And honestly, when I talk to a lot of my friends in tech, which may tell you something about friends in tech, the overwhelming favorite scene of the last 2 seasons is from season 1. I think it's day 15. I forget which day, when he sentences the assassin Azura to what is maybe the worst fate possible with Twitch of speakers. Now, this may be because my friends want to have the power over other human beings. That may be a factor in here.
No.
But talk to us a bit about that, because I think that's maybe one of the things I love about that, because for a show which is so amazing on VFX, visually stunning and creative, that scene is just 2 people talking in the most idyllic setting with just So talk to us a little bit about that scene.
Well, many scenes are a group effort, right? I've got about 6 other writers and we add various things, to the scenes and pitch scenes. But, episode 10 of season 1, I wrote myself. And I set myself a challenge. And the challenge was literally, can I do a scene with Brother Day and Azura with no visual effects at all and no action, only talking? And can I come up with the most monstrous fate for this character possible? So I was racking my brain to come up with just what is the most monstrous thing I could possibly think of doing to someone. And that's what I came up with. And it's chilling because, number one, it shows you the assets, the power that he can command, right? That he could track all these people down, thousands of people, and have, them all under surveillance. It shows you how monstrous he is in terms of his vanity and his capacity to be sadistic. And it's a chilling scene. But then again, one of the other things that we do on the show is we do a lot of visual symmetry. So there was a scene in this season, episode 7, in which the current day meets with Sarah in the same location. And that was very much by design. I said, I want to go back to this location. It was in the script. I want them to sit there in the same place. The audience will have a sense memory of what happened there before. And from the get-go, without even saying anything, the audience is just going to get more and more and more uncomfortable. Yeah. And just worry for Sarah and worry that he's going to do something similar to her. And he comes very close to it. And so there are lots of, there's lots of symmetry, visual clues, visual pairings, visual motifs that we do throughout the show. Sometimes people pick them up, sometimes people don't pick them up, or if they go back on a rewatch, they pick them up. We're trying to make a show that people can watch more than once and pick up associations that they may not have been able to pick up the first time.
When you talk about the visual element, my couple favorite things, and we'll stop after this, Sriram. I know you have a lot to go cover today. One was that, you mentioned Chekhov's gun. For me, the castling device and Riose and when he applies it on Day, the emperor, and gets pushed out of the spacecraft. Like that I thought was cool. But Riose switches his uniform to what the emperor was wearing. And now suddenly he's much more powerful because he's the one who figured it out and he's alive in this moment.
Yes.
And with this juxtaposition in this visual imagery of power transference through this chain link kind of outfit that he's got, I thought was just really beautifully done, especially when he's sipping wine, but he's in this emperor's garb.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I'm glad you appreciated that. And again, we're playing around with visual metaphors because there was a discussion with his husband Glaywin prior. Basically, what if we take over?
Yeah.
What if you become emperor? Right? And for a variety of reasons, Bell didn't want to do that. But by putting him in the emperor's clothes, literally at the end, you get to see a tiny glimpse of what would the world be like? What would the galaxy be like under the rule of Emperor Riose?
Brilliant. Just so brilliant. And, we're going to end the foundation part, but I would just want to say, if folks haven't, what an amazing piece of work. And I can't wait for season 3. I know you're going to get more into 3 laws of robotics, Demerzel. There's so much more to go on there. Can't wait. Now, the other part I want to talk to you about is, if we talk to anybody who's kind of like a kindred spirit, and you ask about some of the piece of pop culture that has influenced the most last 20 years, The Dark Knight is up there, right? It is an iconic cornerstone of pop culture, similar to Jurassic Park, Jaws, it's iconic. And I remember, everyone kind of remembers watching it for the first moment. And it's interesting because when I think about that, it's you and this guy called Christopher Nolan, who's made a couple of movies since then, much earlier in your career, right? He wasn't quote unquote Christopher Nolan. Now you are obviously much earlier in your career, and you're given the Batman franchise with Batman Begins. And for some folks maybe kind of here in tech or don't work in the creative arts, right? You're given this franchise, right? It's kind of coming off the whole, kind of the campy versions, Batman Forever, Batman Robin, etc. The Joel Schumacher stuff, maybe almost kills the franchise, as Clooney says. And now we're given the franchise, right? Talk to us a little bit about the process. I mean, you folks are obviously, first, it's incredibly creative. Talk about your process, Nolan's process of, okay, how do you make decisions about tone, villain, character, story arc? Because there's so many ingredients and Lego pieces you're trying to juggle. So when you're given that, how do you even decompose? How do you go about that?
I think we got very lucky, and I'll explain why. And I do think this is something that can be ported into the tech industry, right? Even by the time we were being approached, Batman was a massive property for Warner Brothers. They'd already had the Tim Burton movies, a little bit diminishing returns with the Schumacher movies. They'd had animated shows. It was a massive, massive property. Arguably their most valuable property. And that and Superman. And when you have something valuable like that, you become risk averse as a corporation. You don't want to damage the so-called IP. I particularly don't like the phrase IP because we're talking about creative works. You don't want to damage the IP, so you become risk averse. But the problem with becoming risk averse, right, is you get diminishing returns. The audience wants risk. The audience wants change. And so these two ideas are in conflict with one another. We were lucky because the prior Batman film had been the least successful. It had been maligned by the audience. Warner Brothers had already spent 8 years trying to develop other versions of Batman that had gone nowhere, in many cases by screenwriters that I knew personally. So the IP Batman as an idea had become a joke with the audience and was considered broken. And because it was broken, because the last 8 years, none of those attempts to reignite the franchise worked. Warner Brothers was desperate. And because they were desperate, they were open to the idea of innovation.
Right.
In a way that they would not have been normally, right? And so it sounds revolutionary at the time, but what we pitched is, what if we play it for real? What if it's not campy? Mm-hmm. What if the psychology involved is real? What if the technology is as real as we can make it? And it sounds like a no-brainer now, but that was considered shocking when we proposed it. Everyone said, that's not how you do a superhero movie. That's not, how you do Superman or the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films. But because the franchise had been fallen into ill favor, Warner Brothers was willing to take a risk, to take a gamble. And it's interesting because I can point to another example in a way, which is the Barbie movie that's come out right now, right?
Yes.
Okay. They've been developing that for years. They took a big risk. And I liked the movie. I watched the movie. I took my one of my kids and a bunch of his friends, and I got to experience this. And some of them are trans. It was they took a lot of risks in that movie. They did not play it safe.
Right.
And whoever decided at Warner Brothers or Mattel to do that, to make a movie that was self-reflexive and feminist, to poke fun at toxic masculinity, that was a very canny decision. It was, they did not play it safe, and you see the rewards.
No, can I run a theory past you? In technology,
Sure.
We sometimes have this term called a person who's an architecture astronaut, where instead of building a thing that people love, you sort of fall in love with building architecture for something in the future which may or may not happen. And I have a theory that one of the things that, with Batman Begins is that even Iron Man, with, which kind of famously kind of came together kind of haphazardly, there was no pressure of having to build a franchise. You didn't have to design, leave all these things and, and be like, oh, this thing is going to show up and this character is show up. And I compare this obviously to sort of the DC universe where, and maybe in some cases to what's happening at Marvel now, where I think, I thought Man of Steel is a fantastic movie and Batman vs Superman is a fantastic movie. But there is a world where there's another Man of Steel movie with Henry Cavill, who's an amazing Superman. And it's less like, you're less trying to build a franchise. You're just like, okay, I'm just going to tell this amazing story and maybe it's the last movie, that's fine.
Yeah, I that's true. And that is something that we battle in the entertainment industry all the time and the temptation to run before you walk is extreme. The temptation to say, oh, we're going to plan 3 movies. And that was something that, to his credit, Chris Nolan doggedly resisted. He, as we were building the first movie, he just said, I don't even want to talk about a sequel. If we have a good idea, sometimes we would come up with an idea and say, well, that would make sense maybe in a sequel. And he would say, let's see if we can do it now. Use your good ideas now. We can always come up with another idea. It's a lot of franchises go astray because of that. Because what they forget is that they have to start with a good movie that feels like a complete meal that has a beginning, middle, and end. Yeah. And that is not just a setup for something else.
Yep.
And we have to be wary as filmmakers that as we build these universes, right, that they don't become too inside baseball, that they don't, because then they start, for these to work, my wife has to buy into them.
Yeah.
Who doesn't consider herself necessarily a fan of these. So if she watches something and feels like, I don't understand what's going on because they're referencing all these characters that are not even from the previous movie, but from other movies that have nothing to do with this movie or this franchise, I think there's a danger of getting diminishing returns and actually having your audience contract and contract and contract.
Totally. I think, I think of, for example, I was a huge MCU fan, like any other self-run comic book nerd. And I remember the excitement when you had the post-credit sequence and it was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe there's reference that character. But I think when I see those post-credit sequence now, my level of excitement is so diminished for a few reasons. Number one, some of those things never had payoffs. You're like, I never knew, like Hercules showed up. I had no idea what happened to that guy, right? Like, I'm not sure I'm going to see him again. Right? I mean, there is so many of those and it expands so much as opposed to, if, for example, look at Phase 1 MCU, you're like, okay, I kind of followed the Thanos Infinity Gauntlet story and I knew where this was all headed. Okay. All right. So I think a large part of our podcast is we want to try and break down the systems of people who are not in tech, right? And, like a mini masterclass, if you will. And
Yes.
Your productivity is amazing. For example, I love the story, for example, how you just came with Man of Steel during a break while working with Nolan on, you're stuck on a plot point. Your productivity and creative output is amazing. But maybe talk to us through just the bare bones of, a studio calls you, they give you a piece of IP and they're like, hey, make this into an amazing movie, right? You can hire a team of writers, you can put stuff together, and you're sitting in your office. Where do you start? Do you start on your laptop? Would you get a whiteboard? You just kind of take a nap and dream? How does this walk us through the process?
Look, I try to be very deliberative about it. If it's based on a pre-existing work, and so many TV shows and films are these days, because the conventional wisdom is if it worked in some other medium, then it might work by the, transitive power of storytelling in the second or third medium. What I first try to say is, okay, I'm going to look at whatever this is, this book, this movie, this comic book character, and I'm going to see if I can identify the core DNA of what makes Batman Batman or what makes Foundation Foundation. And if the writer or the creator is alive, I ask them, I come up with a list, these 10 things, these bullet points. Do you agree? When in Adapting Sandman, Alan Heinberg and I did that with Neil Gaiman.
By the way, huge fan. We are huge fans of Gaiman and Sandman. That adaptation blew our mind because I know that there have been previous versions with Joseph Gordon, etc. But this one is just like fantastic, and the cats, everything was just brilliant, totally brilliant.
Well, thank you. So in that case, we had Neil, and we said, do we think these are the core elements that make Sandman Sandman? Yes. And then are there any things that in just your mind we should never do? And so with Batman, we met with the editors of DC Comics, Chris and I, for 3 days in New York. With Foundation, I had lots of interaction with Robin Asimov's daughter. And so I say, okay, have I identified these core elements? And then I go back to the studio or the streamer and say, okay, these are the core elements. Are we in agreement that these are the core elements? Let's just make sure we're starting from the same place. And if we are, then I say, now let's construct a story and make sure we don't betray these core elements. Because if we do, it's not going to work. Because we're fighting the DNA of the project. And so sometimes it happens that you meet and the studio says, no, we don't agree, or that's not what we want. And in my case, because I'm fortunate enough to turn down projects, I say, well, then I'm the wrong person to do this. But it's really important to make sure that you and your partners at the streamers or studios are even perceiving the same reality before you build a story.
Right.
And that's not always the case.
Okay, so you have that, right? Now, one of the things when we met earlier, one of the things you said which really blew me away was like the idea of the writer's room. Because for a lot of people who are not familiar with Hollywood, you often have this mindset of, oh, there's a solo genius who goes off, bangs out late night something on a typewriter or script, and then you get like a final output. But that's not how it works. Like you're very collaborative. You have often work in a room with a team of people. Some of them have different skill sets. So how does that process work? What does a writers meeting even look like? Like, what is a conference? How are you folks like, because the creative endeavor seems so personal and intimate, and you have these ideas of like kind of the struggling solo artist genius. but then you have a team of people who are coming up with amazing output. So, and you're managing them as much as like basically being an individual contributor, in kind of tech parlance. So talk to us about setting up such a room. What makes it work? Hiring, motivation. Walk us through that.
Well, the vast majority of shows are created by multiple writers. There's a few shows where a writer will write every single episode, but the vast majority of them is with a team of writers and a team of directors, which is why you have a showrunner that sits above the directors in television. In movies, the director has the final say. But if you're working with multiple directors and multiple episodes and multiple writers, you need someone to sit atop of it to maintain the quality control, to maintain the through line of the story. So I assemble a team, and I like to assemble people from disparate areas, playwrights, comic book writers. Season 1, we had a writer from Weeds, and we had a writer from The Shy, and we writers from shows that you would not normally think of as, well, they weren't science fiction shows. And I only had one other science fiction writer in the room. And I start off with a brain dump. We had a document of 10 or 12 pages of this is what we're thinking. These are some of the movies we've been watching. These are some of the books we've been reading. Think about this as we get started. And then we spend about 8 weeks breaking the season in a room or over Zoom during the pandemic. Just let's build the superstructure of the show. I have the final say, but I really try to listen to my team. And, if 5 of my other writers are violently opposed to something, most of the time, then I'll listen to them and say, okay, then we won't do that. You want to inspire people and feel like they can do their best work and listen to them. And then every once in a while, you have to be the decider. Or if there's a split decision to say, that's not unlike I would think being a project manager.
Oh, it's very similar, I think. I think what you describe is very much like what a product manager does, or like a CEO of like a very product-centric company does, which is you have a disparate skill set of, engineers, designers, product people, and you're trying to you are the keeper of the vision. It's funny you say that because I often told product managers, you are the showrunner here. I kind of use the metaphor back. Okay, one last thing, we always ask this because a lot of people watching our show are very young and they're trying to get started, right? And
yes.
So for somebody who wants to get started, what are their age, want to get started screenwriting or want to get started writing a comic book, what is your give us your short piece of advice to them who's listening right now?
You have to be fearless. You have to share your work with people. You can't be afraid of rejection. You can't be afraid of criticism. A lot of people are going to say no. A lot of people are going to slam doors in your face. That happened to me when I was starting out. I had a lot of people tell me, no, we're not going to buy this. No, you're not a good writer. No, you're not. You just have to be persistent. You have to be tenacious. You have to believe. And you should create what you know and not what you think the audience wants and not what you think might sell. At the end of the day, the audience tends to respond to things that they feel are authentic, okay? So you can say what you want about Foundation. There are some detractors, but it's definitely unlike most things on television. Mm-hmm. It's definitely a big swing, and it is a fusion of Asimov's work and my vision and the vision of the other writers and the vision of the other directors. And we try to be true to what we have created and have it be distinctive. I mean, that's the thing that I set for myself first and foremost was at a bare minimum, I want to create a show that is unlike anything else currently out there.
And I think you nailed it here with the pilot, right? With, the thing that goes into the sky and, that exploding season 1, the Clone Dynasty. I know we're out of time. You can be a one-liner.
Yes.
Give us a teaser if, powers that be allow you to, of something you want to see in season 3 of Foundation.
Ooh, okay.
Okay, yeah. I'm about to do a Reddit AMA after this, by the way.
Oh,
A teaser is we're going to be seeing season 3 is very mule centric. Front and center, we will be dealing with the mule. There's people that have read the books know that there's some tricks behind the mule, and there will be some tricks with this mule. Not necessarily, I'm not saying the same, but expect the unexpected. Perhaps we're going to zig when people think we're going to zag. We will be exploring the 3 laws of robotics much more with regards to Demerzel and Demerzel's condition.
Wait, actually, can I ask something? Because you live in a moment where the AI is the topic of the day, AI alignment, etc. And the origin of all of that is the 3 laws of robotics, right?
Yes.
So a lot of people watching this are going to be, actually, a lot of our audience is like, in OpenAI and DeepMind, actually dealing with these issues. What should they take away from Asimov and your work with 3 laws? Because it's about as foundational as it gets.
Season 3 explores a lot of that. And we intend to explore the benefits and the dangers of it, perhaps in ways, not in a Terminator way, but in ways that people might not expect. And I would say, one last thing I would say is, we've talked about programming AIs to have emotion, to have feelings, to have empathy. But there are also ways that could go terribly, terribly wrong, even in the base code programming empathy. And so that's something we will definitely be exploring.
Yes. And I think, I know we're out of time. I think that in season 2, where Demerzel has programming which locks her into a suboptimal outcome for Empire, that is a real problem in AI. And so anyway, David, you are a genius. I am so jealous of you. You created some of the most iconic pieces of entertainment. We are such huge fans. Thank you so much for doing this. And, we're looking forward to so much more, amazing storytelling with that from you. But thank you so much. This is such a blast.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
We would love to have you back post season 3 so that we can come in and nerd out some.
Great.
It would be really fun for us.
Great.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks,
guys.
David. Thank
See
you.
you.